Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring my art channel. In this video, I will give you a breakdown of my full process for creating a finished illustration with a full background and a character. A background is not something, or like making backgrounds, painting backgrounds is not something I talk about very often, so this is an excellent opportunity to show you guys how I tend to approach that. But before I get into it, just want to mention that this illustration was done for my original comic, which is called Gloaming Veil, which you can read for free at gloamingveil.com. You can find the link in my description below, and I might mention that again later. And also, just a quick heads up, I'm actually opening my shop very soon in the beginning of October, so something just to put out there. If any of you guys are waiting to get an art book from me or something like that, it will be available again very soon. I know my shop's been closed for a very long time, but I'm going to reopen it again shortly. So let's get to the process. So I've kind of divided into 4 phases so that it'll be easier for me to organize the information that I want to share. And so let's start with phase 1, which is the idea and the composition. So unfortunately, I don't have the actual recording of me drawing this, which, you know what, at the end of the day is actually probably better, because instead I'm going to show you guys the evolution through which I went and kind of explain my train of thought. So what you see here right now is like the first idea. The idea was that I wanted to put my character, Noelle, just having like a quiet moment by herself in the cemetery, which is like her hangout. I don't know, she likes to hang out there sometimes when she's by herself because it's peaceful and there's nobody there. Like the old part of the cemetery where things are overgrown, etc. So that's like the story aspect of it. And of course, since it obviously is about the character, I typically draw the character first. So this is what I had, and then I added some background elements, which you see right here. And so, this required a little bit of construction with some perspective. I don't know how correct it is, but I kind of got the vibe across. And at this point, I already made a couple of adjustments. As you can see, there's like this line up here. That's me just expanding the size of the drawing. So, yes. So I shrank it. Actually, the character was drawn a little bit bigger at the very beginning. And so I shrank both these layers later on in order to zoom out just a little bit. And once I placed the other basic elements, like this is also story related. I'm not going to get into it that much, but there are a lot of things going on here that hopefully later on, when the story is along further than it is now, you will be able to see the significance of some of the choices that I made in this composition, which is kind of cool for me to think about. But anyways, that's for another video, perhaps, maybe not. So at this point, I decided to zoom out again because I felt like the whole thing was just too claustrophobic. So I copied this and put on a new layer, and I ended up with this composition, which is better, and as you can see, I moved some elements around. So I created the space here, whereas before there was an overlap, which I didn't really like, between the two statues. And I made the figure a little bit smaller, so you can see that in the lines left over here. And I just like shifted this statue slightly as well. Just small things like that. And overall, even though I was much happier with this composition, I still felt like something was a little bit off, and it still felt a little bit too claustrophobic to me. So again, I made it even smaller and zoomed out for the last time, at which point I was relatively satisfied. So I think what made me feel more satisfied about this final composition that you see here is the fact that there's basically like 3 figure elements, but I could break it down to 2 main figures that you can see fully, that are right here, the main character and this big prominent statue in the background. So I wanted there to be good focus on both of them. And so you can see how there's like, if you draw this imaginary line right here and right here, so like this is roughly the center of the canvas. Sorry, I can't draw a straight line. Anyway, so yeah, there you go. This is like the center of the canvas. And as you can see, like the the most important elements are like kind of where the head of the statue would be / what she's holding, and the head of the main character. They kind of fall along these two lines that are roughly in the center. So that's what created a better composition than there was before. And then secondarily, there's quite a bit of work I put in with really figuring out how to make a pleasing assortment of leading lines. So leading lines is something that I really enjoy in illustrations and in comics. All my I usually take it into consideration at some point. Sometimes it just organically comes about. So it's like a bit of a instinctual / contrived effort. So in this particular case, you have these two main leading lines, which is something like that, and then there's also something like this going on. So it kind of highlights the center of the canvas again, but then there's a lot of smaller secondary elements. Like I would say everything will roughly just point to the main character's face. So you've got this wing pointing in this direction, and then you've got this arm roughly pointing to this direction, and then you've got like this as well. And her legs are also kind of leading your eye upwards, and everything is pointing subtly to her face. So that was, I mean, these things, like, there's only so much you can do to contrive them, but if you just work with what you have and slightly adjust the way you position things, it's actually quite easy to create a bunch of leading lines that are really working for you in an illustration. So that's basically what I wanted to demonstrate with this. And I will go back to the process recording now. So here we are in phase 2, which is the cleanup and the creation of the solid base, which will be indispensable for the rest of the illustration, painting, whatever you want to call it, process. So the sketch establishes details while retaining basic composition elements. That's kind of the overview. And in case some of you were wondering why I wouldn't go straight into the inking phase, just using the sketch that I made for the thumbnail, which was, relatively resolved, I would say. The answer to that is I've tried skipping the secondary sketch phase before, a long time ago. I have not done this in years, but back when I was, impatient, I would try to just go straight into inking after the first sketch, only to find out that it's a super annoying and frustrating process because things are resolved compositionally, but they are not resolved in terms of shapes or details, which is basically what I want to talk about next, and which is the whole point of this secondary sketching process. So before I continue, I'm just going to take a minute to tell you about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Getting started with your art career can be tough, and just being active on social media platforms isn't really enough. Having a legitimate presence and a professional website will really help to elevate your art brand and make a much better impression on potential commissioners and clients. Even if you aren't doing client work yet, you really have to start somewhere, and Squarespace is the perfect place to get started. I think the most important thing about Squarespace is that it really does have everything you might ever need, whatever you might decide to do in the future. So you won't have to migrate or restart a brand new website like unfortunately I had to do back in the day every time you're ready to expand your business or start something new. So there's a built-in shop function where you can sell digital or physical goods, a payment platform that allows your future customers for a ton of payment options, and you can even offer commissions and invoice your clients directly through Squarespace on their platform. So start curating your unique portfolio today on Squarespace, and once you've finished building your website, you can head over to squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to the video. The secondary sketch tends to be much cleaner than the first, obviously, and because of that, it's actually much easier to ink over it, and so that's one of the primary reasons why I do it. And the secondary reason, of course, is to just polish out a lot of the shapes properly. So even though I focus on the shapes quite a lot in the thumbnail stage, they're still not exactly resolved, and sometimes I'll go back and forth. Like, shapes are a funny thing. It's, if you're just drawing one character in one silhouette is one thing, but when you have these three major elements, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So actually, as you can see to the left here, the second statue that's cut off at the top, I went back and changed the silhouette of it a couple of times. And I will say that even though, like, as you see it right now, that's not the silhouette that I ended up going with. I went back and I changed later on, and I still am not 100% sure if I went with the best version of it. So here you see me going and changing the silhouette slightly again. So it's a little bit complicated. I can't explain exactly what prompts me to make these decisions to change things and how exactly I settle on the silhouette, but it basically just, I think, comes down to serving the overall composition and trying to retain the leading lines that I was talking about earlier. And is not the easiest thing to do, and there's going to be something that I will mention like at the end of the video where I think I could have done some things better. But in any case, that's the whole point of that step. And of course, the next step is the cleanup, which is, to me, I kind of grouped them into phase 2, which is, like I said earlier, clean up and solid base. So the point of inking at this stage is to create a solid base. I know that there are other artists, especially painters, like people that are really focused on painting, that will not do this really line work heavy cleanup step at all, and they will go straight into painting after this. I think, ages ago, I probably tried that method a couple of times, and even though I think people have some very lovely results out of that, to me personally, the reason why I abandoned that is because I like to resolve the shapes and the silhouettes of every object, like all the elements that make up the character and the statues, and basically I need to know like ahead of time what the silhouettes are going to be, so I prefer to do a very, very I guess final cleanup with the line work, so that later on in the process I'm not going to be changing any of these things. And whether that's the best approach or not is actually very debatable, because I found I will always learn something new in every single new illustration that I make, especially with something like this. I don't often draw full finished illustrations with a character and a background, especially in this polished way that this illustration ended up being. And I will say that there's definitely room for change later on, because you simply cannot account for all the silhouettes and how they're going to end up looking by the end of an illustration when it's in full color and when lighting and tonal aspects start to come into the picture. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but for the most part, I still find that this process is something that I feel the most familiar and the most comfortable with. And to me, that comfort of kind of making these big decisions earlier on really helps me finish things properly and not get stuck in an endless experimentation stage, which I found to be kind of a big problem with not putting down solid shapes and silhouettes earlier on in the process. So of course, the first thing I do is refine all the shapes, or I guess do the final cleanup for the main elements that are relatively solid. It's kind of hard to explain how I make the choices on what I do outline and what I choose not to outline, because this is something that I'm actively figuring out as I work on my comic. Something I haven't mentioned in this video yet is that this process is essentially an expanded version of my regular comic page process, and I will mention like exactly what the differences are. A little bit of the difference will probably be in the line work, so I typically go with slightly less details in the line work for the actual comic. But you know what? It's actually pretty negligible. So the level of finish in the line work is relatively similar to the comic pages, I would say. And so when I did a bunch of pages in the first chapter of my comic that included a lot of backgrounds and characters, I would selectively ink some background elements and leave some out just for like free painting later on. And I think typically how I end up making that decision is the really solid elements that are pretty important to the composition are the ones that I will typically ink. And then things that are more impressionistic, that can get moved around slightly, and the kind of decisions that can really be made on the spot without the silhouette having to be super particular, or you know what I mean? Like, so typically with things like grass, bushes, foliage, all that stuff, like the ground, any rocks or whatever details, flowers, any little things that I choose to put in later on, like where the placement of those is not so important that I have to plan it ahead. It's something that I can easily just add as I go along without worrying about it. Same goes for the silhouettes of the shrubs. I can just be a lot more willy-nilly about how that stuff is gonna go, so I do not do those things with line work. And this is something I actually discovered over time. So when I was working on this graphic novel I did called Grimoire Noir, I did start out with inking way more background elements than I do now, because it was just something that I didn't think about, and I would ink everything first and then flat everything after. It was a lot more of a straightforward process, but I think it created a lot of extra work that was very unnecessary. So while I was working on that comic, I eventually discovered which elements I can really leave up to chance, and which I am not willing to leave up to chance. So that's how I came up with sort of like a strategy on what to ink and what not to ink. So as you can see, I inked all the elements that were important, and I moved on to the next phase, which is what you're looking at now, and that is the color and mood phase. So that includes flatting, first of all, like putting all the flat colors down, and then coloring all the background elements and populating all the empty areas that I left up to chance. All of that is included in this phase, and essentially by the end of this phase, what I'm going to end up with is a result that will look very, very similar to the final when it's zoomed out. So essentially I'm going to establish like all the colors, all the lighting, all the basic impression, like the basic impression of the illustration, and when I'm zoomed out, it's something that will look very similar to the final. But and then I will talk about the last step afterwards, even though the last step is actually like probably where the majority of the time is being sunk. That's the step after this. So as you can see, I slowly go through all the elements, and there's a big reason why I changed the colors of the lines. So essentially, when you have black lines, it will automatically and immediately flatten your image and make it look more like graphic and abstract. And so for that reason, I always subdue the line work in this step, even though it is a bit tedious and it might seem like a really extra step to take. I do the same thing in my comic because I really don't like the flattening effect, because it kind of destroys atmosphere, in my opinion. Like, this is my gripe with most comics that I read, is that atmosphere is just not there. Like, so few comics that I read have a changing atmosphere. Everything just gets flattened by the heaviness of the line work, and that's the one thing that I'm trying my best to avoid, because I love the depth of atmosphere that you can create with without relying so much on the line work, even though, as you can see, I still quite heavily rely on line work, so it's a bit ironic. But anyways, so after subduing all the colors of the line work to make sure that they don't flatten out the image, I start working on the background. And I forgot to mention this, but the color scheme for this was somewhat pre-established, so I can't say too much about how I go about picking the colors in this particular illustration, because I actually already did that while I was drawing the comic panels that have this same color scheme. And you know what, for the most part, is just trial and error and trying to keep it simple. So I am a big fan of analogous color schemes for the most part, with maybe adding like a pop of color sometimes. I don't actually actively think about color theory when I do these things. I just go with my gut and try to create a vibe. So this is all just trying to create a vibe. And sometimes I'll think about how, well, oh, it's such a sunny day. Like, this is what I was thinking about when I was putting down these colors. It's such a sunny day, but there's so many dark colors, and I keep bringing in more and more dark tones. So I was starting to feel impatient, and I created this layer where I tested out the lighting. And then I put that layer away because it's typically not a step that I do at this point. And I want to finish all, I want to finish a good amount of the illustration before I put in the secondary lighting layer, because it goes over top of everything. So I just did a quick test, saw that it will look good, and I felt more confident in just continuing along the process that I was doing. So I'm just adding all, or like most of the elements that were missing up until this point. So I put in all the shrubs, all the like the ground, obviously tried to create a little bit of depth with the size of the grass blades. Could have probably done a better job doing that, but you know, I was feeling impatient because I actually initially wasn't even going to spend nearly as much time on this illustration as I ended up spending. But I was thinking to myself how I rarely get a chance to work on a full finished illustration that I can polish and learn things from. So I decided to just take the opportunity to do so. And yeah, as you can see, part of the step is putting in shadows. So I usually do 2 shadow steps, maybe 3 actually. So the first, they're all very similar to my comic book page process. And so I'll start with gradients, and then I'll do like a basic shadow pass, and I'll do a secondary shadow pass. In this case, I went pretty easy on the shadows. I didn't put in as much work as I typically would maybe in the comic pages, because I knew that I was going to leave a lot of the polishing and the paint over for the last step, which is what I don't do in the comic process. So that's basically the biggest difference. And so here I put in some work here and there, and I think these types of shadows that you see me putting in right now, they're called ambient occlusion or something like that. Yeah, I'm not gonna get into the technicalities of this because I don't even know how to explain it exactly, but I think you can just Google the term and find out what it means. But yeah, and the way that I put shadows down is by just creating like a layer on top of everything that is set to multiply. And I'm not really gonna get into the details of how I organize my layers. I think that's probably just like for another video. If you guys are interested in knowing exactly how I utilize layers, and if you want me to do like a deep dive into that, I can certainly put on the list and make another video about that later to just get into a more detailed breakdown of that. But for this video, I will just focus on the basics. So as you can see, this is the secondary the second shadow layer that I was talking about. So this is where I slightly deviate from my typical comic process. Is I'm putting a lot more detail, like I'm putting multiple shadow layers in, much more than, like probably double the amount of that I would in a regular comic page. And I don't know if this is necessarily the best thing or not, because like I said, I'm still learning and I'm discovering like how to tweak my process all the time. And yeah, this was again a point where I was reaching that I wasn't sure if I liked how dark it was getting. And so I was starting to get very impatient to bring back that overall lighting enhancement step, I suppose. So I'm kind of trying to rush through this stage in order to kind of just like finalize it and give myself a glimpse of what impression is going to make at the very end. So I'm doing that right now, and my main goal was to just make it look a little less shadowy, because I used a lot of dark tones and like a lot more darker tones than I thought I was going to use. So what I focused on here mostly was to lessen the tone, like make the secondary angel figure, like the full angel figure in the background, much more radiant and like lit, I guess, with the backlighting than it was before. So it's less dark, and obviously added a much warmer tone into the overall illustration. And I kind of planned out some sort of a leading line situation with the lighting as well, which is kind of secondary to how I was doing it with the figures and the outlines, the silhouettes of the figures in the first place. So here we are finally at the final phase, which is phase 4, and that is basically just paint over and polish. And this is the single step that gets massively expanded in my illustration process. Typically, with my comic process, this step is very short. It doesn't take much time at all, but it does make a huge difference. But I do not go into each crevice of all the elements painting over things, and like I don't do anything like that in the comics. And so that's basically the biggest difference between my process with final, like big illustrations that are more polished and painted versus comic pages. So as you can see, it is quite a tedious process where I will just spend hours on. I think in this particular case, I maybe spent like 5 hours doing the paint over, and it was pretty relaxing. I will say around the 4th hour probably is when I started to lose patience and just wanted to get it done. And my overall experience of making this painting, I think I can refer to it as a painting because of just the sheer amount of paint over that I did over the lines. Like I said, the lines helped a lot, kept everything in place. I was very happy with all the silhouettes just being established already. So all I had to worry about at this point was just trying to create somewhat believable lighting, which is, you know, not the easiest thing in the world. I think probably to some degree it comes naturally to me, but I can still see how I really need to do some actual painting studies in order to get better at this particular step, because I mean, I don't know if you can tell, but it's a guessing game, so I'm just doing whatever, like making a lot of arbitrary decisions here, because as far as references go, I found a pose reference for the angel statue in the background, which I will insert here. But I did not have references for anything else in this piece at all. So it was all just purely a guessing game and just trying to create the atmosphere and just letting the atmosphere kind of lead the way. So in a case like that, where you really have nothing to work with as far as, like, you know, references, it really is, yeah, I think it requires a lot more studies externally, so which is something that I don't do enough of, and I'm hoping to do that because I do want to get better at painting. I really like nicely painted digital artworks, and I would really want to elevate my own illustrations to the level of artist that I aspire. But like I said, I don't get the opportunity to do this very often because I am super focused on my comic, and so I was trying to figure out certain parts in this particular painting. And one of the things that I was trying to do as a, like, this is not something I do with my comic pages, of course, because I don't spend nearly as much time. So this is kind of like my advice on trying to integrate elements within the painting to make the whole thing cohesive. So I can't explain much about how light and color works, but I do know that the things reflect off of each other, and in shadows you can often find a lot of colors other than just like plain black or just one tone. So one of the things you can do in order, like one of the things that I do at least in order to integrate the figure into the background and kind of like spread the atmosphere around so the character is just not popping out of the background, is to bring in surrounding colors. This is something that I did a little bit later on. Another thing that I find actually quite challenging is doing folds, because sometimes most of the time my approach is more graphic, so I'll just make shadows and shapes that I think look decent and then just kind of call it a day. But in this case, because it was way more painterly, I had to think a lot more about folds and fabric, and it's not the easiest thing for me, so that's actually another thing that I want to study. But in any case, so here's kind of a demonstration where I'm bringing in a little bit of the surrounding colors into the colors of the character. So I just color picked the lightest part of the sky and did a bit of a rim light on Noel's hair, and I also took some of the greens from the surrounding area and incorporated them into some highlights on the hair and into some of the shadows. So I didn't go overboard, because sometimes when you go overboard with something like that, it can create a muddy effect, so it's something to watch out for. So I found that just being subtle with this is probably a good way to go, and also taking into consideration how reflective a surface would be, like technically. So there's a lot of fabric that's actually not very reflective. Like I didn't bother bringing much secondary colors into her sweater because I figured it's just probably kind of dense and very fuzzy and not like wouldn't reflect much color, versus I figured the fabric of the skirt would be more smooth, so that'll reflect a little more, etc. I could go on about this forever, but excuse my cat, I'm just on a roll. I'm gonna let her out as soon as I'm done filming this. But yeah, that is the completed illustration, and it's probably the most time I spent on an illustration in a very, very long time. But I'm glad I was able to record the process and share it with you guys. I hope it helped you. The one thing that I forgot to mention while I was talking about this is obviously contrast, which is a big part of making illustrations. And I just made sure that the biggest contrast is where the character's face is. So that is the very last thing I wanted to say. And I hope you enjoyed watching this process. I hope you learned something from it. Okay, I'm back here with another recording because I totally forgot I was going to include a segment at the end, which is now, to kind of give you guys a quick demo of how I would go about reassessing my own work, essentially just giving myself a critique and giving you guys a glimpse of what my thought process is like when it comes to changes. So this is the final illustration, and just looking at it after about a week of separation where I wasn't constantly staring at it for a few days in a row, is there are a couple of areas that I might want to make changes to before I actually make prints out of this, which I am definitely planning to do in time for the reopening of my shop at the beginning of October. So here, this is the first area that I don't like. I'm going to explain why. This cluster right here, just the lighting looks kind of weird to me, and I don't know if I don't know. Basically, I gotta go back there and change something in that area. I think more specifically, it's like this, including the knee right here. So there's something going on with the lighting that I want to revisit. Another thing that I noticed while I was making the video is something that I lost is, I don't know, like, okay, this area over here is kind of dark, so I don't like how it's creating like this dark lump. So I might go back and change something about that as well, though at this point it's hard to say exactly. Actually, you know what? I'm actually seeing what I can do here. So perhaps I will take this drapery over here, kind of get rid of this, and instead maybe make it go down further like so, and then light it in a different way, something like this. Basically, I'll figure it out. And I noticed how I kind of lost the leading line that was pretty direct from the wing, because now that the wing touches part of the statue, I might just go and change the silhouette over here altogether. This is just not liking that area. Moving on, gonna do something about it. And I was actually instinctively putting the vine over here and didn't think about it, but I can see how it actually did create a continuation for the leading line that I'm missing now, which is good. So that's a bit better there. And another thing that's been bugging me is the tone of this tree right here in the background. So I don't like how it's like the same tone as the wing over here. So I think I gotta go in and like lighten this entire area maybe. There's just some tonal overlap going over here that's kind of a mess. And I miss the cleaner silhouette of this wing and this leading line. So this leading line is getting lost because now this tree is in direct competition with it. So that's kind of what I'm gonna try and change. And I mean, other than that, I think it's fine. I will say that this kind of looks lazy to me now that I look, but I don't know if I'm willing to put in any extra work. And one other thing that I kind of forgot to talk about, and I suppose there's not too much to talk about. So somebody asked me on Patreon about the distribution of detail. So just the general theory is that you want to put in the most details and the most sharp details in the in and around the focal point. So as you can see here, like I pretty obviously put the most detail and the most work, like the most delicate kind of painterly work, into Noelle's face and her hair and just like this area over here. And secondarily, I put quite a bit of work into the background statue. I mean, I put in a similar amount of work to this statue, but I think I did okay in not going super overboard. But like I said, I want to revisit like this area and kind of fix it because I don't like how it's looking. It looks kind of, I don't know, it's lacking intentionality to me. So yeah, and as for the rest of it, I was trying to be sparing with the details. Like I actually might go back and blur out these bushes because I used this brush that does create a bunch of foliage, and it is quite detailed, and I'm thinking that maybe I might want to subdue that detail a little bit and blur it out, because to me when I zoom in it's kind of fighting with the rest of the illustration now that I look back at it. And it might help with creating like more depth as well, which I think at the end is, I mean, it's fine, like it's really not that bad. And I might want to blur out maybe these trees as well. I don't know, this is like just thinking out loud here. Hopefully that is kind of a good glimpse into what goes on in my head when I actually make these decisions. But yeah, overall, like, I mean, this area is a little bit of a mess now that I look back on it. And maybe if I have the patience, I'll just actually look up a reference on how really established painters, like really nice background painters, tackle grass and such things, because I never do this. I don't really have like a go-to method of how to make it look good, and so I just arbitrarily do whatever and like hope for the best. And in this case, I don't know if I'm exactly happy with this area. I might just kind of revisit it and see if I can make it a little bit better. But yeah, these are the things that I have noticed after being away from this for about a week, which is very helpful, because honestly by the time that I was finished painting this the first time around, I couldn't see any of this. Like I was blind to it. So that's just kind of what happened. So I would always advise to take some time away from the painting so that you can revisit it with a fresh set of eyes. And with that, I conclude the explanation of the process of my painting of illustrations that include a character and a background. So hopefully you enjoy that, and that is it. If you have not read my comic yet, please do. You can find it at gloamingveil.com for free. And of course, as I mentioned in my other videos, my Patreon is there to support the production of the comic, and the posting schedule is 10 pages ahead of my website. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you subscribe and turn on the notifications so you don't miss my future videos. And I will see you in my next one. Bye!